Hi guys, it's Crystal. I hope everybody's having a good week or has been having a good week. I know the weather's been really bizarre this week, and I find that I talk a lot about the weather on here. But hopefully in the next few days we'll see some sun and that'll make everything better. Um, if you're new to my channel, welcome, and hopefully you enjoy my content. And if you're a returning subscriber, hi guys, and I hope that you guys are all doing well. Just remember that if you guys want to see more of these videos, remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave me some comments. I do love to hear other people's thoughts and theories on the cases that we discuss. I also want to remind everybody that these videos are for entertainment or educational purposes only. And that if you do choose to leave a comment, no hate, please. We're just here to discuss. No one should be attacking anybody. There's enough hate in the world as there is. Today, like I said last week, we are going to be focusing on the village murders, specifically the unsolved village murders. We're going to look at a couple from the 1960s and the ones from 1975 to 78. And just in case you guys wanted to have a visual, here's what some of the village look like. And also, I do want to show you a really specific picture. I'm going to see if I can bring it up really well for you guys to see. This picture right here, because it has a couple of the central locations we'll be talking about. Now, we should probably discuss a little bit about the village's history just before we get into the cases. So, in the early 1800s, a man named Alexander Wood, who was a merchant and a magistrate, decided that he was going to purchase 250 acres of area just off of Yonge and Carlton Street, and Church and Wellesley was within this 250 acres of area, and just use it as another extension. So Mr. Wood was an interesting cat. Like I said, he was a wealthy man, and he used his position of power to proposition other men. This was scandalous in the 1800s, obviously. And in 1810, he was run out of town for a little while. But he did come back. He actually came back 2 years later and just resumed his work. He died in 1844, sorry. And in about 1850 thereof, they actually added Alexander and Wood streets to this central location. Alexander Wood is technically the forefather of this community. There is a statue that they erected to him in 2005. I think it's on the corner of Alexander and Wood, just showing that he is the forefather of the community. Now, in the late 1800s, this area, this 250 acres, became the home of prominent people. So a lot of mansions and various large, like upscale buildings were built here. And this is where a lot of the city's more famous people would live. But by the stock market crash, 1920 to the 1930s, this area had fallen into disrepair. Obviously, stock market crash, a lot of prominent people lost money. So that could be one of the reasons, but it fell into really disrepair. It has been talked about as being seedy. There were like flop houses there. There were a lot of boarding houses. But by the 1950s, they regentrified this area and they started to build the first high rises there. The first high rise in Toronto was actually built in the community in the 1950s. And they found, it was found that a lot of single men who were from the LGBTQ plus community gravitated toward this area because they could live on their own without their families basically nosing into their business or trying to be into their relationship business. In 1975, the first community center in Toronto was actually built in this area too. Now, in the 70s and 60s, most of the bars and areas that popped up were owned by straight people. So a lot of the bars and the discos were owned by straight people. But by the 70s, a lot of LGBTQ plus patrons decided to own their own establishments. So there was a lot of LGBTQ plus owned establishments popping up, and the church became even more like a community. Church Street, I should say, Church and Wellesley Street became more like a community. Like I said, in 1975, this first community center, which is the 519 Community Center, 519 Area Code Community Center, was built. And they offered a lot of community group activities for people. It wasn't just specifically the LGBTQT plus community. They had programs for a lot of different other people, like AA met there, parenting classes were there, but they were the first organized gay youth group. I think it's called Gay Youth Toronto, came from there. They had groups for elderly gay men, and I would assume elderly gay women, and they had parenting classes, LGBTQT plus parenting classes for individuals, but also for couples there. In the 80s was really when the village became the village. It was really when the village became politicized and the LGBTQT plus community members all came together. Whereas before you'd have different pockets in the community of people believing in different things. Now they came together for the common cause of their own civil rights. And the reason why was February 5th of 1981. Police decided for some reason that they were going to descend on 5 central bathhouses in the community. They made 300 arrests that night. And the arrests were for being keepers or found-ins at a bawdy house. Now, it's either bawdy or bowdy, depending on how you want to describe it, which seems like a very antiquated charge for me, so I did actually have to look it up. And it was, basically speaking, a house, so you could be an owner or someone who came to the establishment that were there for either soliciting sex from other people or engaging in indecent acts. That's what the criminal code says, indecent acts. So they arrested 300 people. This is actually the second largest arrest in Canada. It's second only to the arrests they made, mass arrests, that they made in the during the FLQ crisis in Quebec in the 1970. This really solidified the community as a political force because they weren't going to take this anymore. These charges are very bizarre, and it was almost like the police wanted to make an example of them. And this is when the village became the village. There were protests. Obviously, they were peaceful protests, and people would march through the streets. And in 1981, for sure, Toronto's Pride Festival was held at Church and Wellesley and in the community during this time. I think they had pride parades prior to this, but this is when people were screaming for their rights for sure. So Pride, as far as I know, the Pride Parade is also held in this area. From then on, it has been. So actually, the village entered pop culture in 1993 from Kids in the Hall. And if you're Canadian, you'll know who kids of a certain age, you'll know who Kids in the Hall are. A couple members actually had worked at the Second Cup, and the Second Cup is known also as the Steps. It was a place where people congregated to meet each other, to talk about issues, to talk about political issues that they wanted to be involved in, and to just meet up with friends. So the Kids in the Hall actually made the Second Cup, the steps of the Second Cup, part of their skits. So if you guys ever watch old Kids in the Hall specials, you'll see that the community is focused in that. And also in the year 2000, from 2000 to 2005, Queer as Folk was actually filmed in the village in Toronto. Woody's is a bar that was also mentioned in Queer as Folk, and it was one of the central places that they went to. you'll hear a lot about Quest, the St. Charles Tavern, and Parkside Tavern. They were all in this area, but it was in the 70s. Woody's is one of the central bars from now. Queer as Folk was depicted as happening in Pittsburgh, but it actually was filmed in Toronto. And my brother and I actually went to the Village at this point in time to look at it. And it's a very neat place. If you guys haven't been there, I do suggest you go to it. It's a beautiful place. It's a very warm and welcoming community. Now, the community has started to branch out somewhat from just Church and Wellesley. It's incredibly expensive to live there right now. So a lot of the LGBTQT plus youth are branching out to Cabbagetown at this point in time. So now we're going to discuss the murders now that we've gone through a little bit of the history of the Village. If you want to check out more history of the Village, there's a lot of websites that you can go to and just look it up. There's books that you can look into too if you want to check out more of the history. Now, murders have been happening in the Village before it was even known as the Village. I'm going to keep referring to it as the Village, but you guys will understand that it's this central hub. It wasn't really the Village until the 80s, but we're going to talk about it as the Village, even during the former years. So there have been a number of notable murders since at least 1949. We're not going to talk about those ones because a lot of those ones were solved, or they at least we're pretty sure who did it. I mean, in some of these cases, you'll find that they're pretty sure who did it, but a lot of those ones were solved. If you guys do want to look at a murder timeline for this from 1949 all the way up until this year, I suggest you check out murdervillage.org. It's got a lot of information on it. You can see pictures there of the victims, not of the crimes, it's of the victims. And if you guys do have any information, once again, I urge you to call the police in Toronto, York, Peel, whichever region you want to, or the Toronto division themselves, the RCMP, or Crime Stoppers. Like I said, it's anonymous. I know that in my time frame, these murders don't seem that long ago, but they are somewhat, 40, 50 years ago. So 40, 50, 60 years ago. So if you guys do have any information or know of anybody that does have information, please pass this on so we can solve these murders. The first murder we're going to look at was December 18th of 1967. Now, a man was out driving around and he noticed some partridge. So he stopped, and this was at Balsam Provincial Park. He stopped to shoot the partridge and found a body. The body was decomposed, but it was nude, except for one white tennis shoe, size 7, that was found on his foot, and another one that was found close by. It's also interesting to note that this victim actually had an extra rib on his right side. His hands were bound with twine, his wrists were, and there was an 11-foot piece of twine found near his body as well, found with the body, they said. He remained unidentified for 42 years, but police suspected at the time that he was murdered by a man named James Henry Greenwich. It's either Greenwich or Greenwich. It depends on how you want to say it. Now, Greenwich is a serial killer. He did target gay men and he did target prostitutes, but he was never charged for this murder. He wasn't identified until 2009, and he was identified thanks to, once again, facial reconstruction models. The RCMP, or well, the OPP actually, I should say, hired someone to do a facial reconstruction of him in the hopes of identifying this person. And he was found to be 18-year-old Eric Jones. Now, Eric Jones actually went missing in May of 1967, and his family did report him missing. He was in the Toronto area, and originally he lived with an aunt first, but then he later resided by himself in the high rises. If you'll remember, I did say actually, oh, sorry, I had something in my throat. In the 1950s, the first high rises were built in Toronto, and the first high rise was actually built in the Village. So like I said, a lot of single gay men would live there because they didn't have to hide who they were anymore. So Eric lived on his own at 18. Now, his sister identified him, but did say that the police did know that he was a missing man. However, his case was closed in the 70s due to the fact that the police were uncertain whose name was actually on the file, if it was him or his brother. I don't know why they mixed that up, and I don't know why they didn't contact the family to ask. I know in a lot of the earlier investigations, because the community was so marginalized, because there was so much bias due to attitudes on the police force, and because there was so much rampant homophobia at that time, a lot of these deaths were not investigated in any way but a cursory way. A lot of times the victims were treated like they actually caused their own deaths, like they were a perpetrator in part, just because the police didn't approve of their lifestyle. I do want people to know that in 1969, homosexuality was actually decriminalized in Canada by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's dad, because he said the government has no place in somebody's bedroom. They're absolutely right. But that didn't stop the police from having these attitudes, or the general public to some extent for having these attitudes. I know it seems like we're going to go back in time. We're actually not going back in time. But July 15th of 1967, a youth was spotted getting into a car that was a white Chevy Corvair. And it was driven by a muscular African-American man who was later identified as Mr. Greenwich. Now, Mr. Greenwich has actually changed his name to just James Henry. And as far as I know, he's actually in prison right now. I can't be 100% certain, but I think he's in prison right now. He was not found until July 15th of 1968. And he was also not identified for another 40 years. They used facial reconstruction models again, and he was identified as 17-year-old Richard Dickey James Hovey. And he had been missing since July 15th of the year before. So they did have the witnesses saying that he got into this vehicle, this white Chevy Corvair, with this man. These cases are linked together. Obviously, because of how they were found, Dickey was also found with his hands bound. They were bound with shoelaces this time, and he was also found nude. He was found in Schomberg, which is outside of Toronto, but they have been linked. The police, however, never charged Mr. Greenwich with these murders. I don't know why they didn't. He was suspected in both of them. They were pretty certain he did it. But because of the careless attitudes and the natures of the crimes, the police did not charge him. So now we're going to skip ahead to 1975. And I'm sorry, guys, I am going to have to refer to my notes from time to time, just because there were a lot of dates and there are a lot of victims. And I just want to make sure that I'm actually doing justice to these victims so that they're not forgotten, but also giving them the respect they deserve. So December 18th, 1975, a phone call came into the police at 3:43 a.m. saying that there was trouble at 286 Borden Street. This phone call was from an unidentified man. He didn't want to be identified. And the police, it was actually made from a payphone. Police determined it was made from a payphone close to the residence. Police went to the house initially that morning, early in the morning, and noticed that it was locked up and silent. I don't know if they knocked. I don't know anything other than that. They just left. They left because it didn't seem like anything was going on. Now, the original homeowner of the Borden Street place came home in the morning. I'm going to call him the original homeowner because it just makes things easier, and discovered a body. That body was a 51-year-old Arthur Harvey Walkley, if you want to get really into it. He was 51, like I said, and he was a part-time lecturer at the University of Toronto. I'm not sure what he lectured on, but he was a part-time lecturer there. He was stabbed. He was also naked. He was stabbed 4 times in the chest and once in the back. Now, police were resummoned, obviously, to the house and looked at his body and everything else. And it was known that the night before, Arthur had been at Quest, which was a club in the village area. Like I said, I just want to remind you to keep Quest, St. Charles Tavern, Parkside Tavern in your minds. These were clubs that were frequented by a lot of the victims. But he was known to be at Quest that night, and he did stay until closing. He left alone, from what everybody said. So sometime between 2 and the 3:43 a.m. phone call, he was murdered. It is also stated that he took a taxi ride home. So I don't know if they're trying to implicate possibly a taxi driver doing this, but he did take a taxi home. It's also interesting to note that the original owner's wallet was also missing from the site. I don't know if Arthur's wallet was missing, but I know the original homeowner's wallet was missing. And that his credit cards later on were found to have been used in Moncton, New Brunswick. So they actually sent a sergeant down to Moncton, New Brunswick to check things out. He looked at the 4 stores they were used at and also several motels in the area, but he came up with nothing. So no suspect, well, there is a suspect, has ever been arrested. No one has ever been arrested in Mr. Walkley's murder. The next murder happened December 20th of 1975. I'll say initially it happened then. Fred John Fontaine, who was 32 years old at the time, was found severely beaten in the bathroom of the St. Charles Tavern. He didn't die until May 15th of 1976, but it was a direct result of his beating. That's the only information that's given. He was 33 at the time that he finally succumbed to this. So he was younger than Arthur. I want you to keep in mind their ages too, because there could be connecting links between them. And there has never been anybody identified in his murder. No assailant was ever identified. The next murder was February 11th of 1976. And this was a man named James Douglas Taylor. And he was killed at his home, which was on Erskine Street, by way of a beating from a baseball bat. He was 41 years old at the time and a house painter. And police responded once again to a 911 call just prior to them discovering the murder. I don't know what was in the 911 call. Obviously, someone made it. Could it have been the same man that made the Arthur phone call? Unknown at this time. Although police were told that a pickup truck had been at the Erskine residence just prior to the murders. Then we get to September 20th of 1976, James Stewart Kennedy. Now, James Stewart Kennedy and Arthur Walkley are linked together. They have linked their 2 murders specifically, so definitely this is the work of one person. He was found in his home. Sorry, I just want to get every detail right. Beaten to death once again after police responded to a 911 phone call. He was also strangled with a towel, and his face was severely beaten. It was also known that 2 days prior to him being found, he was at the St. Charles Tavern. And they believe that a man named James Allen Walker murdered both Arthur and Mr. Kennedy. Once again, this lead was not followed up. This man is suspected, but there was no investigation done into whether he actually did these crimes, and he is not named as the perpetrator. He's just a suspect. January 25th of 1977, Brian Lataki, who was 24 years old at the time, was found by his sister. He was murdered at his residence, which was 141 Erskine Avenue. So we've got two I must say that James Douglas Taylor lived on Elmhurst. I'm having problems talking right now. But Brian Lataki was found, on Erskine, 141 Erskine, and he was actually found by, I think he was found by some friends. I'm not totally sure. I know police responded at 9:40 a.m. to a 911 call that was actually placed to say that this man had been murdered. Not only was he nude, obviously, he was tied to his bed and he was stabbed, strangled, and tortured. So if you guys remember, Mr. Kennedy had also been strangled, and a lot of these men were beaten. Brian was only 24 at the time, and he did work for Toronto Dominion Bank. It's also worth noting that there were items missing from his home, and that whoever did this crime made sure that their fingerprints were cleaned up from the scene. Brian was the sixth man murdered in 2 years from the village at this point in time. So the village at this point in time is very scared. It would seem to them, like it would seem to us from hindsight, from looking this over, it would seem to them as it would seem to us that somebody was preying on people in the community, specifically people that seem to have gone to the St. Charles Tavern, which was in that one photo, at various points in time. The next murder happened. It's also known that then police inspector George Sellers said he didn't know if all the murders were connected at the time, but they seemed to involve men who frequented Yonge Street homosexual establishments. That's what this man says. That's why I'm air quoting it. And Brian was seen hitchhiking from the St. Charles Tavern just prior to his death. The previous night, they actually said, so just prior to his death. If the phone call came in at 9:40 a.m., it would be sometime in those early morning hours that he was likely murdered. May 5th, 1977, Bernard Guay, who was 62 years old, was found severely beaten at Allen Garden Park. This crime does not seem to fit in with the others. It does because he was severely beaten, but police have, I don't want to say identified because they haven't identified. Police did see 3 youths running away from the area, from the crime scene at that time. Now, Mr. Guay was partially blind. And he was in a relationship at the time that this happened. No one seems to know why he was in the park. The particular area of the park that he was in, police say, was basically a stroll. It was frequented by people looking for sex. So they wondered if that didn't have something to do with it. But it seems like robbery was the initial motive for the crime. Like a mugging was the initial motive for the crime. And then it led to a beating. He was found on May 5th and he succumbed to his injuries on May 11th of 1977. The next crime we're going to talk about is a fairly well-known one, actually. It happened on September 20th of 1978. A man named Alexander Sandy LeBlanc, who was only 29, was found in his home on Joseph Street, St. Joseph Street, and he was stabbed over 100 times. So once again, you're probably making connections in your head. I know I did. You've got a lot of stabbings, a lot of beatings and stabbings. It seems like an escalation, whereas before maybe it was just beatings and then all of a sudden stranglings with towels and stranglings with other various pieces of equipment. And then, elements of beatings all the time. So it just seems like they're connected. Now, Alexander would more fit into the timeline well, you could say of Dickie Hovey, because of their ages, of, Dickie Hovey, and also of Eric Jones because of their ages. But their police are pretty sure they knew who did that, even though they didn't investigate it or solve these cases in any way. He also seems to more match up with Fred Fontaine and Brian Lataki, just because their ages were young. If you've noticed the other men that we've talked about, so that would be Arthur Wakely, Mr. Taylor, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Guay, they were all older individuals in their 50s and above. And except for, I think, Mr. Taylor, who was only 41. So you're looking at 40s, 50s, 60s. And also, like I said before, they're pretty sure Mr. Guay was an intended victim of a mugging that turned violently brutal. Now, Sandy was so well known because he was actually a co-owner and a manager of a lot of different establishments in the village. So people knew who he was. He was stabbed more than 100 times, and he was found by 3 of his friends. I believe he was also nude at the time that he was found. He was found in his bedroom, and there were footprints leading from his bed to a window that overlooked an alley. I don't know how high up it was, and I don't know if this person tried to use that as a way to escape. It's also interesting to note that the investigators said that his blood had saturated the floor to such a degree that the carpet squished underneath his feet. So this was very much overkill, and it does seem like it was someone who knew him at least, or knew of him. But no, once again, no suspect ever identified, nothing ever found. November 28th, 1978, William Duncan Robinson was found by his sister horribly mutilated in his Vaughan Road home. Now, he had not been to work for the previous 2 days, so that's why his sister decided to go over to his house, wondering what had happened to her brother. He was found tortured, tied to his bed, strangled, and I believe beaten. This was like a massive case of overkill. And it is believed he was murdered. Police believe he was murdered by somebody he met at the St. Charles Tavern, because 2 nights prior to being found, he had been there. In case you wanted to know, the St. Charles Tavern was located at 484 to 488 Yonge Street. That's just to give you guys a general address. A neighbor reported hearing the Saturday night a strange hollow sound coming from his residence. It's interesting to note that I want to call him by the right name, that Mr. Robinson was actually the 14th murder from 75 until 78 of a gay man in the village area. Some of them were solved. Some of them obviously were linked together, but some of them were solved and were done by partners or people that were under arrest for these crimes. But a lot of them, like we have discussed, were unsolved. Now, Mr. Robinson was described as shy, and he was also described as being a really great dresser. And police believe that they had enough of a description of Mr. Robinson's killer to put out a composite. So the man that killed Mr. Robinson was described as having long, dark, greasy hair, long brown, like dark brown, greasy hair. He was also described as having really bad body odor, very dirty hands, and a stumbling type gait. Like it looked like he walked very clumsily. Which could, maybe he was under the influence of something, I don't know. They know he was trying to score drugs at the St. Charles on that Saturday night, and that he rolled his own cigarettes. Now, despite them putting out the composite, and I will show you the composite in a few minutes, despite them putting this out, nothing ever came of it. This man has never been identified. So I don't know. Now, if you look at Mr. Duncan's murder, it does seem like an escalation from some of the other murders. The fact that he was strangled and he was stabbed and he was tortured and he was tied. I mean, this seems like it connects him to the other murders. But police haven't necessarily said that any of these men are linked. Now, I know what you're thinking, because next week we are definitely going to get into the more recent, from the 2010s until 2017. Village murders. And I want you to keep that thought in your mind. Did these murders have something to do with Bruce McArthur? He would have been in his 20s at the time. So I just want you to keep that in mind. Is there any connection between these murders, the unsolved murders, and the ones from 2010? Is there any connection from the unsolved murders with other serial killers? I know that James Allen Walker has been identified in at least 2 of them. And we know that James, it's very interesting, they're both Jameses. James Henry Greenwich was also identified for the 2 earlier murders. But the police still haven't connected them. They are still unsolved to this date, even though there may be a suspect, even though police were leaning towards something. Now, since the 2010s to 2017 murders by Bruce McArthur, police are looking back into the unsolved cases with fresh eyes. And they're trying to release more information, more pictures, more websites, just to see if they can bring closure to the families. The police have changed an awful lot since the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s even, in the fact that they are trying harder for the community, and they are trying harder to find links and to solve these cases. And I think they're treating the families better now too. But like I said, if you guys do want to watch a really great documentary on it, you can watch The Fifth Estate on the unsolved village murders. The Fifth Estate also talks about the solved village murders as well. And I'm just going to bring up a couple pictures for you guys to see. You don't have pictures of all of the victims, but I do have a couple pictures plus the composite. If you just give me one quick second. Sorry. Okay, so this right here is Brian Lataki, 24. And this is the composite. I know, this is a really scary composite. This is the composite sketch of the man that they believe killed Mr. Robinson. Or actually, this is a, oh man, I don't know why I did that. That was a picture of the man believed to have been in Brian's presence with Brian Lataki the night he was murdered. I also want to show you this right here is Arthur Walkley. 51, the man that basically mobilized the community. It was his murder that started the terror. Now, I do want to point out that Mr. Robinson's murder was also highly publicized. The other murders may not have been, but the community was outcrying at this point in time. And media was all over this story, especially since Mr. Robinson was the 14th murder of a gay man in the village in only 3.5 years. You guys do have to understand that it was 3.5 years. And like I said, at least 8 of these are unsolved, if not more. Some of them, like I said, they do have links to certain people. I don't know why they weren't investigated the way they should have been. I can theorize that it had to do with bias and prejudice. I don't know what other clues were left. I mean, at Brian's house, remember, the man did wipe his fingerprints. So he did seem to have some type of knowledge of that. I'm just going to look through because I think this is Sandy LeBlanc. So Alexander Sandy LeBlanc, the one that was stabbed 1,000 times, or the one that was stabbed 100 times. And this is Mr. Robinson. Now, unfortunately, this is the only photo that I could find, and it was of him being brought out in the body bag. But it did start to connect and politicize the community. And there was a lot of fear. And that fear was not seen again until the 2010s. The community was certain, I think at that point in time and in the 2010s, that a serial killer was actively picking off people in the community. And the police did not seem to either want to listen or did not seem to be able to connect all of the murders. It remains to be seen that there were at least 2 serial killers active during this time. We know in the late 60s cases, it was Greenwich, and this man is a serial killer. James Allen Walker had killed at least 2 of the men. The police assumed he killed at least 2 of the men, so there's a definite connection there. But I want people to remember that it seems that in these cases from the 70s, a lot of them took place when either people came back from the St. Charles or at St. Charles Tavern. A lot of them involved older men. Although Sandy LeBlanc was 29, I mean, it's possible he could have been mistaken as somebody that was older too. A lot of them involved beatings. A lot of them involved stabbings or stranglings. And it seemed like an escalation from just beatings, just stabbings, to beatings, stabbings, strangulation, or beatings, strangulation, stabbing. And then all of a sudden, escalation to 100 times being stabbed, or also an escalation to torture. A lot of them were found nude. Some of them were found tied. All of these were men, and they were men from the community. So there was a lot of public outcry, and there was pressure on the police to solve these murders. I know that there are rewards in some cases. I think that's a more recent development, but I just want you guys to keep all of that in mind in this timeline. Now, once again, murders didn't stop after 1978. It was just that this particular type of murder, where it seemed like it was a serial killer, it seemed like there was a lot of commonalities and similarities, were not going on to that extent. So from the 80s to the 2010s, yes, you would still have murders. Yes, it's probable that people could have been murdered by serial killers, but it was a lot more domestic violence that they were seeing then, or acquaintance murders, people that knew each other. If you do want to check out, like I said before, if you do want to check out a more inclusive timeline, something that will include everybody from 1949 until right now, I suggest that you check out murdervillage.org. That's where I got a lot of my information from. Some of it I did get from books, but that's where I got a lot of my information from. And I urge you to look at that. I urge you guys to look at the history of the village too. And I urge you guys to wonder to yourself, why were these cases not solved? Even in the case where they had persons of interest, they had connected links to a serial killer. Why were they not solved? And the big question was, did the majority of these cases have to do with a serial killer? Is it a possible serial killer that maybe was active again later on? it's a possibility. So yeah, I know. I'm sorry to have to leave it on that note, guys, but because these are unsolved, we don't have as much information as we could. If you guys do know of anybody or have any information on these crimes, once again, I urge you to contact the Toronto Police, contact the RCMP, contact Crime Stoppers, in the hopes that we can get these crimes solved and get justice for the victims and for their families as well. Next week, we are going to take a look at the 2010 solved village murders. We're just going to be looking at the individuals themselves and some of the police work done. And hopefully you guys will stay tuned for that. And then the week after, we're going to talk about the big guy, Bruce McArthur. Hopefully you guys will watch these videos all as a series. You don't have to. They're just for educational or entertainment purposes. And remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, share if you want to, and leave some comments. I hope you guys all have a great next week, and I will see you later. Bye.